This is a dialogue I had with Rex, who I very recently encountered through some comments that he left on a couple of my videos. One of these was the video on Jordan Hall's Dionysian Christianity, which also, funnily enough, is where I first encountered Javier Velasco Suarez, who I most recently did a video with. And so this will now be the second time that I've been able to have a really fascinating conversation with someone who left a comment on that particular video. So that's awesome. At the beginning of our talk, our discussion, I will read some of the comment that Rex left and give my response, and we'll go from there. So I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but I want to say a few words at least about the title that I've given this conversation, the beginning and the end of the story. I would say that tentatively, at least, I would hold a Nietzschean position about life. And so in that sense, life necessarily includes suffering. Life is expansion, life is striving, life is self-overcoming. And as part of this process, there's joy, and there's always also going to be suffering in many different forms. And Rex's challenge to me was, yes, suffering is meaningful. Suffering is even perhaps valuable within life as we know it. And in that way, he is in agreement with Jordan Hall, as I understand him. But what I'm missing, and what this view is missing, is the beginning and the end of the story as shown in the Bible. The beginning being Eden, being the paradise at the beginning, God creating the world perfect, and the end being the New Jerusalem descending from heaven, the dead rising from the earth, a new creation in a sense, or a perfected creation in which the saved will live eternally in happiness. And so his challenge to me is that this is the full story, this is the complete picture. The middle, which is what I focus on, which is life as we know it, is just that. It's the middle between these two ends. And so we discussed that a lot. We discussed that in depth. The subtitle I've given it, The Place of Chaos and Suffering in Paradise, comes as a consequence of that. So Rex develops the theory that perhaps there is in paradise, whether it's the paradise at the beginning in Eden or the paradise at the end in the world to come, that there is a place for chaos and suffering in that paradise, and in that, in fact, chaos and suffering may actually be necessary to happiness, to flourishing, to life in any form, even perfected and eternal life. Now, I do want to note that Rex objects to the term suffering because it has such negative connotations. So maybe we can say something like tension, something like unpleasantness. There's a form of this potentially that is conducive to greater happiness, greater joy, greater meaning, and not destructive overall. That's the proposition that I think we arrive at, which is a really fascinating one, that maybe paradise contains the optimal necessary amount of suffering, or whatever you want to call it. And in that way, the riddle is resolved of how can we have life without suffering, something like that, which is kind of the focus of a lot of these videos I've been making lately. So that's what the talk revolves around. There's a lot of little fascinating little rabbit holes we go down. There's a lot of insights that spring up. So it's not just this. There's a lot more. It goes on for 2 hours. It could have gone on for a lot longer. But be that as it may, I don't want to spend too long right now at the start talking about it. So let's get into it. Just like the conversation I had with Javier, neither of us have our videos on, so there's nothing much to look at if I just played the Zoom recording. So Instead, I leave you with a beautiful painting. This is Christ in the Realm of the Dead, so very relevant to what we're talking about today. If you enjoy this video, please like it. If you like this kind of content, please subscribe to this channel. And if you have your own insight that might spring up listening to this talk, please leave a comment, or if you maybe have an objection to something that either of us say, or if you have your own position or view that you want to share, please leave a comment. That would be greatly appreciated. I always try and engage with the comments that people make on my videos. So with that, I give you my conversation with Rex. All right, Rex. So I encountered you through some comments that you left on some videos that I made. The first one you made was on the video Jordan Hall's Dionysian Christianity, which seemed to have got a little attention, which was good. But you, in many ways, kind of agreed with what I said, but there was a but, which I think is important. And that was that in your view, and this is a Christian view, you're coming from a Christian perspective, you said that, I'll read out what you said. You said the primary difference in this case would be that Nietzsche made no claims about what comes before or after, where the Bible explains where the story started and where it ends. Ultimately, Christianity embraces life as a part of the greatest story and the suffering that is part and parcel to it. The reason that I suggested that you agreed with me about many of the things, and with Jordan Hall for that matter, is that suffering is essential to life, suffering is important to life, but I guess the distinction would be that for Nietzsche, life is everything. There's nothing beyond life. And so while life is always suffering, it's also joyful at the same time, but there's nothing beyond. But for the biblical story, there is something before this life of struggle and suffering, and there will be something after this life of struggle and suffering. And maybe we could say that what was before was Eden, was the original paradise, creation before the fall, and what comes after is the New Jerusalem, the world to come after the resurrection of the dead, this perfect world where we will be happy, peaceful, free, etc., etc. And I think that's a really good point. I think that's a really interesting idea. My response to that, though, was to kind of ask the question, but this before and after, where do they come from? Are they maybe just projections of what takes place within life? Maybe they're just projections of moments within the process of life. So what I mean by that is that we could say the before, the Edenic paradise, is, if we're looking at it on a micro level, maybe it is before we go out on a quest, before we initiate some course of action to get somewhere we want to go, using very general terms there. It could also be childhood, the kind of innocence of childhood. And then paradise at the end, the perfected creation, of course, on the micro level is reaching that goal that we've set for ourselves, achieving the thing that we were seeking to achieve. That brings happiness, that brings joy. It feels like we've accomplished sometimes everything we need to accomplish. Although the point being that that is never true. So what my point was is that within life, we have these little cycles of, pre-striving, so the peace before striving, striving for something, the accomplishment, the happiness that comes after the striving, but then the cycle repeats itself. And it always continues like this. Nietzsche would say that's because that's the nature of life. The nature of life is struggle, overcoming, continually expanding, and seeking more and more and more. But with that struggle comes suffering. And so my proposal was, or my question was, when we think of original paradise or final paradise, aren't we just maybe projecting things within life which can't be separated from life? What would peace be if it was stretched out for eternity? What would happiness be if there was no contrast with suffering and all there was happiness? It seems like these concepts break down when you tear them apart from the process of life in which they're embedded. So I've talked a bit there just to set the scene, but I'll pass it off to you. How would you um, respond to that, or what thoughts does it bring up for you?
So there's a lot to touch on there. One of the things is, I think, so let's start with this. I would agree with Nietzsche's assessment that life is comprised of this cycle, right? It's essentially the hero's journey, right? The hero starts out naive, then there's some kind of conflict, and he has to go on this adventure to resolve that conflict. And in the process, he suffers, remakes himself. And then at the end, it's not just that he solved the conflict, but that he's a more real person at the end, right? So you see this in Luke Skywalker, for example, right? That's essentially Luke's story. Would you agree that that's kind of what Nietzsche is describing?
Yes, I'd say that's definitely a big part of it. Exactly.
So I would say that I would affirm that. I would say he's correct in that assessment. That is the nature of life. And I also would say that the Bible validates that conclusion. I think if you look at all of the stories in between that describe human existence in, I would propose at a deeper level, but that's kind of a different conversation. You see the cycle of resting, striving, suffering, triumph over the circumstances, and then resting again, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how exactly we would define those terms. My instinct as a Christian is to call it rebirth,
Mm-hmm.
right? The process of Christ's death and rebirth is kind of the ultimate example of that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think from a biblical perspective, that is affirmed. Now, the difficulty comes in when we look at these ideas of Eden and New Jerusalem or heaven. We end up with this question, and this actually has always been something that has bothered me with the common Christian understanding of heaven. If difficulty seems to be inherent to human life. In fact, it's inherent to being finite creatures,
Mm-hmm.
period. There's just no way to overcome that. And the biblical claim is not that we become God, that we become infinite. And I think your conversation with Javier detailed this well. We don't become infinite, we become finite creatures that are tied to an infinite being. If I sum that up well.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens to this suffering? It's an even bigger problem when you think of it as growth. And I think that's the root of your criticism, if I understand correctly. You can correct me if I'm wrong, that life is uninteresting without growth. not just it's uninteresting, it's worse than being uninteresting, it's pointless
Yes,
without growth.
that would be one way to say it. Yeah.
And I think this is, and to something that Peterson always points out is Dostoevsky's the character in Notes from Underground, which I've read that. So that's at least one thing I've read.
Mm-hmm.
Dostoevsky makes the argument that man would never tolerate such a paradise,
Yes.
that they would do all they could to upend the world. But the interesting thing is Dostoevsky's a Christian. So there must be some way to resolve this problem.
Mm.
Otherwise, Dostoevsky is a hypocrite, or maybe not a hypocrite. He contradicts himself
Mm-hmm.
in his ideas. So that has bothered me. That problem has bothered me for a while. It's like that just doesn't really make sense. On the opposite side, we're faced with a different problem, right? So if we say that heaven and Eden and heaven and New Jerusalem will not have this problem because it will be the same as it is in this life, we're left with a different problem, which is the reality of evil.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I don't think I need to make a very strong argument for why suffering is bad. Like, even from Nietzsche's perspective, I doubt he thinks that suffering is only good. Would I be right in that
Yeah,
assumption?
like that's a good point. I mean, suffering is negative. We don't like it, we avoid it. Um, I guess if he was to say it was good, it would be because it's part of life and it's an essential part that can't be removed. Um, in that sense, it's good.
Okay,
But not in this, well, no one seeks suffering for the sake of suffering. So that's
right.
not the view put forward here. Yeah.
And I don't think any moral person can make the claim that the suffering of children or the innocent is good.
Um, I mean, yes, on the one level, you're absolutely right. But for Nietzsche, who wants to affirm all of existence, he's bound to say that because the suffering of children is an unavoidable part of existence as we know it. So on that level, he would say yes.
It's a reality, is what he would say, is what I understand.
It's a reality. It's not something you can just say, well, this is Nietzsche's view. But, you know, we can't just say, yes, I'll have life and reality in this world, but just don't want any suffering children, please. Like they come together for Nietzsche and, so he affirms the whole. But he has no particular predilection for having children suffer. He's not a monster or something like that.
Right. So that's what I mean is we're left with this problem. Because on the one hand, if the afterlife, in whatever form it takes, is a place without suffering, it seems to um, reject what it means to be human, what it means to be a finite creature. In reverse, if we uh, completely affirm the reality of suffering, we also affirm all the horrible things that are involved with that. And if heaven affirms those things, then I guess most people, especially most Christians, would say, is it really heaven at all? And it's
Yes,
no different to the current world, right?
exactly. It would be no different. So why call it heaven? It would just be a continuation of this life, as we know it. I
Right.
think I think that's a really good statement of the dilemma. Yeah.
So I think that there must be a way to harmonize these perspectives. And I think there's a few things I would call on. One is finite creatures in relationship. So, and I should take a step back first. I think there's a case to be made that the evil involved in suffering is separate to the cycle as we've described, this idea of striving and
Mm-hmm.
all these things. I think that these can be divorced from each other
Mm-hmm.
in a convincing way. And I think one aspect of this is in relationships with finite creatures. Because the reality, we know in heaven we don't gain all of God's knowledge, right? Theoretically, that would make sense.
You're right.
If we
Yeah.
remain finite creatures, we don't gain his knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Anything that we would gain has to be taught to us. And then we become more, but we're still less than the infinite, so we're still finite. Would you agree with that?
I would agree, because I think if we had God's infinite knowledge, we would have to ourselves be infinite, and that comes back to the same logical problems that Javier and I talked about. So I would agree with that.
Okay. So what happens when let's say hypothetically, I have a friendship with someone. I don't have all knowledge. So theoretically in this friendship, in heaven, I don't know everything about the other person.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's a natural potential for conflict as a result.
Mm-hmm.
Because let's say I'm coming to a party, or this other person invites me to a party and says, bring a pie. And I show up with a strawberry pie, and they're
Mm-hmm.
like, no, you had to bring apple pie. And there's some kind of conflict between those two things. Now, I don't think you can have relationships between finite creatures without having that conflict. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would agree with that. That follows.
Okay. Now, do you think we can have that conflict without suffering?
No, I think suffering is entailed by that.
Why? What
Uh,
is it about suffering that makes it inherent to that conflict?
because I guess on both sides, there'll be a level of disappointment. I mean, there'll be numerous, I mean, the suffering will be small, obviously, in the case of bringing the wrong pie. Um,
Right.
and also, by the way, where I come from, a pie means like a meat pie,
Oh, okay.
or like a steak pie or something, which would be an
So
easy,
we've
yeah,
so we're just gonna have this conflict, right? You
yes,
tell me bring a pie, and I show up with a fruit pie, like a
yes.
sweet pie, and you're talking about a savory one. So yeah,
So the conflict would be slightly larger, but either way, obviously, we're talking about a small conflict. But still, in that small conflict, there would be suffering, because there would be disappointment, embarrassment. There would be the disappointment also of not um, understanding your friend or unknowing your friend well enough. Um, there would be there would be numerous small examples of suffering. Maybe you actually have to go out and get the right pie. I don't know. Maybe maybe no one wants to eat your pie. I don't know what it would be, but entwined in that would be all this suffering. The key suffering being, of course, that disappointment, that embarrassment, that sense of having let your friend down, and that sense of not understanding, not having a close enough relationship with your friend.
so do you think do you think, okay, so that seems to make sense at first glance, but I can envision two people who are mature enough and take responsibility for their feelings enough that that conflict does not resolve in suffering. You could certainly see how that confrontation devolves into hell, right? Where people become mortal enemies in a friend group for
Yes.
the rest of eternity and hate each other.
Yes.
And I could also envision the opposite, where the conflict is resolved, maybe laughed about,
Exactly.
and there's no strife from it.
Yeah. I mean, I take your point, and yeah, that laughter, that, you know, if actually in a way might form a closer friendship, there'd certainly be an advance in understanding just because you know that fact. But you know, the appropriate thing would be to laugh about it together. Um,
Right.
that's right. But I mean, this is like I said, this is a sort of small example. Is there suffering inherent in that? I think there is, but we have to look very carefully, and we have to have a very expanded sense of suffering. Um, you know, for instance, the Buddhists say that life is suffering, life is dukkha. They don't mean that life is like, you know, sheer physical pain, but they do mean that within life there's always a sense of distress and disappointment, but it's very, very it can be very, very sort of hidden and implicit. Um, Once you start meditating, for instance, and attending to your body, you actually realize that there's all these little pains and discomforts when you start attending to your, you know, your psyche. You realize there's all these cravings, um, you know, disappointments occurring all the time. This is completely consistent with Nietzsche. He just wouldn't say that that means you have to reject life. He would say that that's just part of life and life is good. Um, but I would still insist that there is suffering there. That might not go against your point, though, because we might want to admit some suffering into paradise and just leave certain types of suffering out. Or would you want to insist that there really is no suffering in that example?
It depends on how we define suffering. And this
Right.
is
Yeah.
the reason I use that example is partly because it points to what I think the resolution is later, but because it opens the door to the conversation about the definition of suffering.
Hmm.
I think it's interesting because you talk about Nietzsche proposes that suffering is inherent to life. And it seems that the Christian perspective is that suffering is not inherent to life. And there's a distinction to be made here from one perspective, the world we live in now, the world that Christians live in and have always lived in, the
Hmm.
world that people have always lived in, except for Adam and Eve. So we're talking the vast majority of people,
Hmm.
uh, suffering is a reality and it is inherent to life. I don't think no one escapes without suffering. So, in one sense, in terms of present experiences, suffering is very inherent to life. And this is also sort of a part of what I was pointing to when I said Nietzsche has the present, but not the beginning and the end.
I also
Um,
think, sorry to just interject, but I also
no,
think there may be some scriptural evidence for suffering even in Eden. I mean, for instance, when Eve receives her curse, I believe it is that the pain of childbirth will be greatly increased. You probably know your Bible a bit better than me, right? But it's not like she didn't have pain in childbirth before. It's that it's now increased. Um, Also, they're doing God's work in the garden. So, you know, it's not the intense labor of Adam's curse where the ground will sort of struggle to yield, you know, yield produce for him, but it's still work. There must be a sense in which they're tiring out their muscles and, you know, it's also probably necessary. Like, this is what I say when I say, you know, I'm a bit apprehensive about heaven, because I don't really want, if I was in Eden, I would kind of want to just do some work all day, you know, and then I would enjoy the sweetness of resting my limbs and sleeping. And then, you know, like that's just a natural cycle. But what do you think? Do you think that there was suffering in that sort of small sense, that sense of like, you know, muscular tension, muscular pain, you know, like the kind of suffering that's just part of life but not overwhelming? Do you think that was present in the garden?
I would argue that. So first of all, you're correct. It does say that about um, Eve, that he says he will multiply her suffering, not that
That's
there
right.
is none.
Yeah.
Right. So if we're going to take that in a literal sense, then that means there's some inherent suffering. So that's interesting, I think. But I think you're right on when you talk about work. And this was going to be my second point on why I think we have to separate these concepts from each other.
Hmm.
Because the curse of Adam is not now you will have to work. It
Hmm.
is that work will not come without suffering,
Hmm.
or suffering is inherent to work. Um, so I that was my next problem with this idea of heaven that has no growth is work is not evil and work is inherent to growth. I mean,
Hmm.
if let's say, what's often the case with Christian ideas of heaven is that everyone's given in heaven, everyone's given, or in the New Jerusalem, everyone's given a task that they have to complete, right? It's their task that they were made to do.
Hmm.
So let's say I'm an architect. There's an inherent struggle to being an architect because I'm not perfect. I have finite information, as we discussed. So I'm given a task to build this bridge. I have to learn how to best build that bridge. And it might be, are you there?
Yep.
Yep.
Sorry, I'm still there.
Okay. It might be that there are going to be multiple iterations of the bridge that I design over a long period of time. And that's inherent to our finite nature. So I once again, is that suffering? Is the prolonged labor to complete a task, is that suffering? And I'm not.
I guess we would have to then find a definition of, if not suffering, the thing that we're focused on, the thing that is bad or evil um, in the world.
Right.
I think it is suffering in the broadest sense of that word, in the sense that it is distressing or uncomfortable. I think that it's suffering, but you want it at the same time. You know, you want that if you're engaged in work that you're doing willingly. Um, I guess I would see it more as just a continuum. So there's suffering that we readily accept because it's necessary for a task, or it enriches life, or it creates a kind of contrast, like I was talking about before, right? If we never exert ourselves, we never get to enjoy rest. If you're just constantly living in a life where you don't exert yourself for anything, you don't therefore have rest. You have the absence of rest. You have a kind of restlessness. And so we need it for contrast as well. I would see a continuum between those things and the more severe things. I think there's the type of suffering in the middle where it's like I've started to do this task. It's really difficult. It's really overwhelming. I'm not sure if I should go through with it. But then you go through with it and you're like, that suffering was worth it. You know, I don't know if you're raising children, you know, and you're just never sleeping or something like that. I mean, you might be suffering a lot, but in the end, it is well worth it. Um,
Right.
but then, of course, you've got the other extreme where the suffering is completely overwhelming. Um, and then you get cases where it just may not be worth it. Um, I just see that as a continuum. And I guess that if we're thinking about heaven, maybe the question is there some suffering in that broad sense? So not necessarily saying negative, but saying this phenomenon. Is there some of this that is essential to life that we can't do without? We can't have enjoyment without it? And then is there some other stuff that is unnecessary, negative, evil that we can do without? And I guess where would we draw that line? Do we have any criteria? Like, how can we separate the one kind from the other?
I think that's the problem, right? And this is the problem that we would have to solve. I think if I take your so my thought is that there's two separate things, but I think your idea of continuum can work as well. Something that you said that I think is important in the conversation about rest and striving is that the cycle of work and rest in the Bible predates the fall, which is
Mm-hmm.
the 7-day creation story, and God rests at
Yes.
the end of that. So there's already this idea of striving and um,
Yes.
resting. And I think those are good terms to use. And if I were going to try to put these ideas in words, what I would say is that in heaven there will be striving
Mm-hmm.
and resting,
Mm-hmm.
but there won't be suffering. And I think the context of relationally, as we discussed earlier, tension in relationships is striving to know that person better, to have your misconceptions shattered and then come to know them better
Mm-hmm.
is a process of striving. And all of the shame, self-criticism, anger, and despair that can come from that shattering is where the suffering comes in. And I think there you might see this delineation when you look in Genesis, because the thing that happens immediately after Adam and Eve eat of the apple
Mm-hmm.
is that they become self-conscious.
Mm-hmm.
And that self-consciousness is a recognition of their vulnerability as finite creatures. They suddenly realize how vulnerable they are.
Mm-hmm.
And their immediate response is to try to cover themselves,
Mm-hmm.
which is representative of them making trying to fill the gap of that vulnerability so that they're no longer vulnerable. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that in an image is where suffering comes from. The lack of acceptance of our vulnerability and acceptance of our striving
I think I just
in
want to highlight.
combination
Sorry, go ahead. Sorry, finish your thought.
in combination with the reality of our vulnerability. I mean, there's more to suffering, certainly, because there are innocents that are more vulnerable, that are obviously not responsible for the suffering that happens to them. But in most circumstances, that suffering is caused by, or at least in the most grievous of circumstances, that suffering is caused by another
Mm-hmm.
being who is trying to cover for his
Mm-hmm.
vulnerability. So, what were you going to say?
I was just going to highlight something you said. I found that quite interesting. Was that God in the beginning of Genesis is represented as striving and resting, or exerting and resting. That's really striking that it's applied to God, first of all, because if we wanted to be really theological about it, God doesn't exert himself and rest, because that would kind of compromise his um, being an absolute being. But for this, the purposes of the story and as a metaphor, it is really striking that the whole thing starts out with God going through this process. Um, so far from condemning work and, the alternation of work and rest, like you say, it kind of elevates it to a necessity. It's not just that Adam is working and resting, but God himself is, at least as a metaphor or a certain way, uh, working and resting. It's like that's fundamental to reality or something like that. So I just wanted to highlight that. I mean, I think that the direction that you're going with this is really fruitful. Um, and I think obviously we have a little bit of a disagreement about the word to use, but I don't think that matters much, whether we call it suffering or something else. The point is that there would be a certain kind of, I don't know what a neutral word we could use is, but there would be a certain kind of tension, maybe, a certain kind of uh, tension is maybe the best word, unless we can think of another one, inherent in paradise, because that's just inherent in work. What we would want to eliminate, though, would be the more grievous things.
Yeah.
I guess my response to that would be, again, like how to separate these things. To me, they really do seem like a continuum. It really seems that the one shades into the other, or it can potentially shade back. If we look at the example of Christ's death, for instance, that would be the most grievous example of suffering. Um, it led to, at least in Christian theology, the resurrection, and then ultimately the resurrection of all believers into paradise. So it's a victory. It's something that presumably God doesn't then disown and say, I wish that didn't happen to me. Um, it's
I,
a bit ambiguous. Go ahead.
so first I wanted to say, if you go, so in Matthew 20, sorry, no, that's not where I am. In Mark 2, verse 27, it says, "And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." I think the implication is, as I understand it, most theologians would make this conclusion that yes, God did not need to rest as defined. If you define him as an infinite being, he doesn't need to rest.
Hmm.
But he rested as an example of how humans are to exist.
Right. Yeah.
So, as you say, the story highlights
Mm.
the reality of people, that they're striving and resting. To your other points, it might be that I'm willing to concede the idea of the continuum, that there's an amount of striving that is, or suffering that is necessary, and an amount that is unnecessary and evil. And um, I think in the context of Christ in heaven, I would agree with you that God is not going to say, I wish this never happened to me.
Mm.
And I would say that the reality is that is going to be true of us also. I
Hmm.
think part of the maturing of being that happens pretty much universally across Christian traditions, though the exact definitions and explanations vary, there's a maturing of spirit that happens over the course of a person's life and into the afterlife. I mean, that's the concept of purgatory fundamentally.
Hmm.
And one of the things that happens as a result of that maturing is a recognition of the importance of our suffering in life, and the realization that we wouldn't want to change
Hmm.
our suffering because
Hmm.
it's made us who we are.
Hmm.
Uh, and that's what in my comment, when I said that the call is for Christ, the call that Christ gives us is to pick up our cross and follow him. It's to embrace suffering
Hmm.
not to reject it. And I think if we then got to heaven and decided we didn't want to have suffered, that would be contradictory to that idea.
And that's actually a Nietzschean idea in a way, because the idea that I'm I am who I am because of what I have suffered, um, and therefore I affirm that suffering. That is, that is Nietzsche's approach to life. Of course, for him, there's no outside of the suffering. But in the Christian vision, there is that time in paradise where you say, well, now there's no more suffering, but I affirm that suffering in life that made me who I am. Um, there seems to be a bit of a discrepancy there. Why is that suffering redeemed in a way, but there's no scope for further suffering because it's bad?
Well, and well, there's two ways I can answer this. One way is I think that there's a development that will continue in heaven.
Mm.
I don't think that you escape that. As I said, it's inherent to the idea that we're finite creatures striving to know an infinite God.
Mhm.
Like I think that that's just a reality of our existence, that we will continue to grow. So if Nietzsche is going to define that as suffering, then I don't think Christianity rejects that
Mm.
conceptually. I think it rejects the place of suffering in the world. There's
Mm.
a way we could look at this. So your other conversation, Javier, just
Mm.
mentioned this in some sense, that the idea of the earth is that everything's out of balance and things aren't put in their proper place. And this stems from Genesis, when Adam and Eve decide to put themselves above the place of God when they take of the apple,
Mm-hmm.
which I could explain that in more detail if I need to. So at that point, we end up in this upside down world where the thing that's supposed to be over all creation is now, by the choice of Adam and Eve, separate from it. And he
Mm-hmm.
respects that choice for various reasons, which gets into a whole nother conversation. But that's the world that we live in, where everything's topsy-turvy. And one of the things that I think you could argue is way out of its place is suffering. If we're going to take this perspective that as a Christian, that suffering is inherent to life in the terms that you've laid out, that there's a continuum. The reason that the continuum is so far away from where it's supposed to be is because suffering, just like every other aspect of life, is not in the place that it's supposed to be. Does
Interesting.
that
Yeah.
make sense?
Yeah, it's sort of like even suffering has a place, which is an interesting idea. But it's itself out of order. Suffering, in its right place would be the type of suffering that we're talking about, where it's essential to work, to exertion, to striving, to growth. That would be suffering in its right place. Suffering in its
Yeah,
wrong place would be, you know, cancer, or the death camps or something like that.
right. And you could look at it this way: suffering, to your reference about childbirth, suffering in its right place is a mother's sacrifice for her child, that's inherent to birthing them and then raising them. And suffering out of place is when the mother dies in childbirth.
Hmm.
It's an inordinate amount of sacrifice. Um, so
What
that's where I
about,
think
just on
you
that
end
point,
up.
sorry, because I think it's an interesting case study, and I brought it up with Javier. What about the actual physical pain of childbirth? Where would you place that?
Well, I think it's in, I think I just answered that question and saying that maybe some part of that is inherent to childbirth, but maybe there's too much of it here. Just like some, so that's Eve's lot, right? And Adam's lot is not, again, not that he works now and didn't before, but that his work will be harder. In the same way, Eve's lot is not that childbirth wasn't painful, it's that now it would be exponentially more painful.
So
So
the pain of childbirth, let's say before the fall, might have been the pain of exertion, the exertion of
right,
pushing a being out of your body, something like that.
yeah.
Not the often overwhelming pain that women experience in childbirth now. Okay, that's an interesting idea.
So one of the things I wanted to talk about, because I think it's relevant to this conversation in the context of relationships that we kind of touched on earlier. So Peterson, for a while now, has been talking about the spirit of play. And I think that there's a certain amount of, to your point about violence, I think there's a certain amount of conflict that's inherent to the idea of play.
Yes.
And I don't think you can escape that. But I also think that I think Peterson is right when he talks about the spirit of play being a solution to the world's problems. So I would say this is another area where the proper place for conflict is the spirit of play. I mean, another problem I have with the typical identification of heaven is I play games all the time, right? It's a big part of my hobbies. It's how I interact with people often, and I've developed good relationships through games. But the conflict is inherent in a game. And I could take this one step further, because the thing I love more than games is stories, and conflict once again is inherent to stories. So am I to believe that in heaven there are going to be no new stories because there's no longer the concept of suffering? That doesn't seem right to
Right.
me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think there will be a different perspective on those things, and it will be in its proper place. So
Yeah.
that's kind of my perspective on that. And it might be, so there's two things I should admit. One is I might have the wrong perspective. Right? It's always possible that I'm wrong. The other thing I should mention is some of this mystery is inherent. Like, I don't think it's possible for us to grasp the plan of an infinite being as finite creatures. So there's some amount of mystery that's always going to be involved.
Of course. Yeah.
But I think we can get approximate insights.
Yeah. I would agree with a lot of what you say there, and I especially agree that conflict is inherent in play. I mean, it definitely is. And I would say for that reason, and maybe you wouldn't go this far, but I would say that for that very reason, the will to power is inherent in play. That is to say, self-assertion, the delight in winning, the delight in ruling is also inherent in play. And that's a point I made in my video in Jordan Hall's Dionysian Christianity, was that sort of as a bit of a pushback against the idea that reality is dependent on only self-sacrificial love. I was trying to make the point that that's true, but it's also dependent on self-assertive, will to power. And there is, I think, and I recognize this is probably not a very Christian idea, but it seems true to me that there is a kind of dynamic balance between the two. There is a kind of ideal space you can get to where self-sacrificial love is balanced with will to power. They work in a harmony. For instance, in a good relationship, I would say that this is actually what's happening. Um, I don't want to completely negate myself for the sake of my partner, but I also don't want her to completely negate herself for me. I don't want either of us to do that, but I also don't want either of us to be completely selfish. That's also going to make huge problems for us. But what I want is that each of us are a strong self, but a self that is giving and open and loving. And you kind of need a bit of both. And you need, again, that play as well. You know, there are there are times where there can be a little bit of conflict and joking and um, teasing or whatever. That's a kind of appropriate type of conflict. And then, of course, there's conflict that goes too far or is inappropriate. But to me, that just says that, again, there is this mixture of self-sacrificial love, will to power, suffering and joy or happiness, all mixed together in existence. So I don't know, don't know if that necessarily goes against what you would say, or whether maybe it harmonizes. What do you think?
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it's like a okay. I should say actually first. I don't like the term will to power. That just sounds
It is provocative,
yeah
intentionally, I would say, on Nietzsche's part. If we
yeah.
can think of a better word, we could use that instead.
I would say we don't need to use a different word. I'm okay with using the word, but I think I should say that I don't like that term because if I take Nietzsche in good faith that he means what you seem to mean, which is like the natural desire for growth of being, if I can define it that way,
Mhm.
uh, then he chose a very poor term that is easily manipulated to mean something that it isn't.
I think it does. I think it does include a lot, and it does include a lot that is morally distasteful. I do absolutely agree. Part of the reason I would say he used it, and the part of the reason he used the language that he did, is because he was trying to push back against a kind of moralizing about reality. Um, and so I think that's part of it. Obviously, will to power can look like tyranny. It can look like violence in a very direct and explicit way. But it can also look like competition, or it can look like artistic endeavor, or it can look like I think it can merge into and become self-sacrificial love. So it has all these different ways of expressing itself, but it's not. I guess I want to protect against the I want to protect against two different impulses. One is to say will to power is only good, and that Nietzsche was just sort of like just being provocative, and it's actually just this lovely thing. And if we all just pursued only will to power, everyone would be happy. I want to protect against that, but I also want to protect against the opposite, which just sees only negative things in the will to power. I think that a good analogy is like energy, right? Is energy good? Or is it bad? Well, energy is good when it's running this computer so we can talk to each other, or running the lights, or helping us cook our food. It's bad when it's electrocuting people or whatever, right? So uh,
Yeah,
it's just But without energy, you wouldn't have any of it. So I think will to power is a little bit like that. Does that help? It's
Uh,
it's the sense of wanting to expand, and obviously that could go in very different ways.
yes. And I would say that that clarifies the conversation, but I think there's more I could say about it. But in direct response to what you said, I think that the natural state of the Trinity involves the idea of growth, because you also have to receive love. If you
Mm-hmm.
have you ever been around people that you want to be generous
Mm-hmm.
and you try to give them something,
Mm-hmm.
and their politeness in rejecting goes beyond the purview of politeness. They refuse to accept.
Yes, yes, I know what you mean.
That's aggravating. And I think you have to also receive generosity.
Yes.
And that's also a skill. And I, in some sense, it could be summed up in what C.S. Lewis says about humility, which is humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less.
Yes, I like that.
So I think the reality of the Trinity is a constant state of love from one person of the Trinity to the other. Well, in order for that to be true, there also has to be an element of receiving. And in the context of play, there's always it's like a dance, right? There's give and take back and
Mm-hmm.
forth.
Mm-hmm.
And often across relationships, if we're talking about relationships, for example, there's sometimes you give in certain contexts you give, and sometimes in certain contexts you receive.
Mm-hmm.
And if we play that out across an entire person's life, you have to receive a certain amount in order to grow so that you can give more.
Yes, I absolutely agree. Yeah.
So, what I would say, and I think this is seen in Christ, because one of the interesting things about Christ's journey is that he was a full adult when he died on the cross, right?
Mm-hmm.
People estimate in his 30s.
Mm-hmm.
That's older than maybe what was explicitly necessary.
Yes.
So there's a certain amount of growth, and then there's even, I believe there's a verse about Christ growing in wisdom and understanding.
Yes.
So that growth is inherent to Christ, just as it's inherent to man, because he took on mankind,
Mm-hmm.
right? So he had to mature. And it even suggests that he matured spiritually in some sense, though, I don't want to go too far into that
Yeah.
because you get into some problems there. But he matures.
Yeah.
So, but he matured so that he could die on the cross and give the church to the Father. And I know I've cut a lot in between there, but you have to grow in order to give the best of yourself.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Another example is, so you see Cain and Abel, and Peterson likes to talk about this story a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Abel gave the best of his flock, and Cain didn't give the best of his harvest.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the difference between those two is growth. Like Abel did the best he could to become the best shepherd that he could
Mm-hmm.
in order to give the best of his flock. You can't just give the best of yourself. There has to be a development, a
Mm-hmm.
rise to meet that sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same with Christ's call to pick up your cross.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a very simplistic way of saying it, but you have to be strong enough to carry the cross.
Yes. Yeah.
So, so I would definitely say that it's a component, an important component. What I'm unsure of if it is on equal footing as self-sacrificial love. or agape. And I would say that its proper place is in service to self-sacrificial love. And I think where you get the tyranny that you described, or the selfishness or abuse or these other things, is when the will to power is not in service to self-sacrificial love.
Mm. I would broadly agree with you. Broadly, I think that through the developmental trajectory of a person's life, we need to be moving more towards self-sacrificial love and away from just a simple, a simple will to power as being just pure egoism. We need to move beyond that. Um, I I'm playing with these ideas, so they're not fully developed, but I feel like there is a continuum between the two. There is a continuum between um, will to power, and that it grows into and flows into self-sacrificial love. And that might be consistent with what you're saying when you're talking about Christ, obviously had to grow to be a full adult, to be strong enough, to be wise enough to do what he did and to give himself in the way that he did. Um, and certainly on the bodily level, and Christ was fully an incarnate human being, his body was doing that all the time because that's what bodies do. They take energy from their environment and assimilate it, you know? And so on that level, he was certainly doing that. There was a will to power in Christ, and then perhaps also on the level of soul. But it was in order to do the great act of sacrifice that he did. So I would say that that's the trajectory of human life. And the other thing to say about that would obviously be that we don't, at least in this world, live forever. So if we're nearing the end of our lives and we're still consumed by egoism and we're still so attached to them, that's going to be a problem. We need to be able to let go and just give ourselves up for the next generation to take over. That's a necessary part of the process. So there's that too needs to come near the end. On the other hand, I wouldn't want a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old sort of like being consumed with self-sacrificial love. There'd be something wrong there, at least in my view, right? And I think there's also ways that people can be afflicted by self-sacrificial love if it's not in the right place. For instance, they can be completely consumed with shame, with guilt, with self-hatred, and that's not helpful. And I think that's the one that's the one true point about, the whole self-care movement. Obviously, there's a lot in that, or maybe you don't agree, but I would say there's a lot in that movement that is toxic. But I think what's true in that is that sometimes self-sacrifice, self-hatred, the negative aspect of all that can actually do very real and deep harm to a person. And we need to offset that by um, a self-assertion, you know, serving oneself in a certain way. But we just can't make that the ultimate end of life because it's not the ultimate end of life.
I I don't think that. So there's a few things. I agree with you that much of the self-care movement is toxic. I would disagree that shame and guilt is from self-sacrificial love. I think it's actually from egoism. I think it's just on a continuum of egoism that leans in the right direction of, instead of the world revolves around me because I'm so great, it's the gravity of my terribleness.
Yeah, it's like an
Uh,
egoism.
yeah, it pulls the world, it warps the world around me. And I think, and that's not, I would say that that's at the extreme. Like, not everybody who feels shame or these other concepts
Yes.
uh, experience that, but I've definitely seen in my own life how that's true. And I think that also goes to C.S. Lewis's quote that humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. I think that that applies there. Um, so I wouldn't categorize that as a part of sacrificial love. I would categorize it as a part of egoism, because I think real self-sacrifice is absent the desire to feel good about yourself, or to feel better about yourself, or to justify yourself. But I think that that is a mode that can get you to real self-sacrificial love, I think. And it's a natural introduction to that point. And here's the example I will use. We look at the example of a young man, the demographic that Peterson speaks to.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially, all he says to us or to those
Mm-hmm.
people are, take on the will to power, make yourself better.
Mm-hmm.
And many people take on that role. And he doesn't say make yourself better because, and he points this out, and this is something that differs from many, as he would criticize conservative speakers, because it's the right thing to do or because it's a traditional thing to do. He says it's because it's an adventure. So that's you can
Mm-hmm.
think of that as an ego
Mm-hmm.
centric perspective, but that naturally breaks off slightly
Yeah.
when you reach to, for example, the young man meets a woman that he admires and loves and wants to care for. And a part of that is egoism, because the woman makes him feel a certain way. And that's how eros starts,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that egoism. But then again, there's a time where relying only on that is uh, it forks, and usually that time is around when that young man has kids with his wife.
Mm-hmm.
He suddenly has to care for them, and then through the self-sacrificial care for his children, he learns the importance of self-sacrificial love, even though that wasn't the goal that he started out with.
Yes.
That is the fulfillment, the
Yes.
point that brings meaning to his life, when he has that aha moment that this is so rewarding when I take care of my children, and the realization that I do the same thing with other people around me that aren't my children. So I would say I would say that it's the will to power is ultimately in service to that thing, but it might be a foundation where the end is not seen. I mean, oftentimes when we take on a journey, we don't know where it's going to end up.
Mm. Yeah. Again, I can broadly agree with that. And I can understand also that as a Christian, I suppose the self-sacrificial love has to be the ultimate. God is love, after all. God is agape. Um, I guess personally, at least at the moment, I would see them as more interdependent. The two sort of principles or motivations. Um, we create, we give ourselves for our children in a self-sacrificial way, but we want them to be selves, and like you've pointed out, to become selves, they need to be selfish. Well, you haven't said that, but that's how I see it. They do need to be selfish. They do need to consume the energy around them, which is the energy of their parents' attention, but it's also the physical energy that they consume to grow. So I see them as sort of being more flowing into each other and out of each other. I also think this is the relationship we should have with God agape from our perspective, like from our side. It's agape from God's side. He's the parent in the situation. He gives himself for us, but it seems a bit inappropriate for it to be an agapic love from us to God. It seems like the more appropriate um, kind of love would be eros. We desire God, obviously not in a strictly sexual sense, but in an analogous sense. Um, But I would say that, as you kind of pointed out before, there's ego in eros. If I desire someone or something, I want it. In a sense, I want to consume it. But at the same time, I value it as well for its own sake. So there's an interplay of different principles there. But yeah, I think that broadly we are in agreement on this. So um, maybe you have some comments on that, but I also thought I just want to offer an opportunity. Did you have any other questions or topics that you wanted us to cover in this talk?
So we've at least dived into I actually think we covered most of the things that um, most of the things that came up in the in your in your other conversations, and your commentary on Jordan Hall. I It's very interesting because, like I said in my comment, I found myself agreeing with both Jordan Hall and your criticism in
Mm-hmm.
some sense. And my intent with this was to try to express the gap that I bridged between those two
Mm-hmm.
things. And I guess what I would say is, in your response to my comment, you brought up, which we've talked about, this cycle of striving.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's interesting, and Peugeot touches on this frequently, that the beginning and end of things is a pattern that repeats throughout
Yes.
human history. And furthermore, I find those patterns as evidences for the greater truth. And that would be my perspective. Whereas you might say that maybe those ideas are just in the hearts of people, and that's why they've become religious beliefs. And that's in some ways, I mean, Peterson's perspective is very complicated, but that seems to be some of his perspective, is that the archetypes are biologically in people, and that religious thought is an extension of those archetypes. But I would say, if that is true, and there's a God that created us, surely then that's an expression of the reality of that God.
Mm.
And this is when I mentioned Ecclesiastes.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Let me pull it up again so I don't misquote it. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. It seems very appropriate to these ideas, because it points to what I'm trying to grasp at, which is this idea that these patterns are reflections of a greater truth.
Mm-hmm.
And one question I would have for you, it can't do you think it really is just biological coincidence that these patterns repeat across time in human literature and religion? Or do you think that there's something more to it?
That's a really good question. I think my position would be similar to Peterson's. I think he makes a good case, for example, for how the hero archetype emerged and why it has a hold on us, because that's just the conditions by, the conditions by which we encounter chaos and advance. It's got a certain necessity to it, and it's become kind of hardwired into us. So in that sense, and I'm not trying to evade your question, I'm trying to answer it, but in that sense, it's based in reality. It's not just arbitrary. And this is what Peterson likes to emphasize. It's not just arbitrary. It's based on the structure of reality, but it's also something that is the consequence of the evolutionary process. So I would say both are true. I think if for instance, we're talking about beginnings and endings, for example, the symbolism of Eden. So Eden in one sense is, well, this is my interpretation. I think it's Peterson's interpretation to a certain extent as well. Eden is, the innocence of childhood that we kind of have a lingering remembrance of in the individual life. It's also perhaps the time in our animal past before we had self-awareness, before we were afflicted by the sense of our vulnerability, the necessity to make moral judgments, guilt, shame, and all that comes with being self-aware as a limited being in a dangerous, violent world, right? All those things come together.
Right.
So it's a reflection of that past. So again, it's rooted in reality. It makes sense. And so it makes sense why it's expressed in myth, or in this case, in the biblical myth of Eden. Likewise, we are always striving towards something. We're always aiming for a better state of being. We're always aiming for further happiness, I would say, in the sense of flourishing rather than in the sense of mere pleasure. But still, we're aiming for happiness or flourishing. It makes sense that the end of the biblical story would be the accomplishment of that. That the Bible isn't a tragedy, it's a comedy in the technical sense of the term. It makes sense. Now, I would accept all that, but I would say that in this case, what encompasses what? I think that's where we have a potential disagreement. I think you want to say that the beginning and the end of the biblical story encompass life as we know it. I actually am more convinced, at least at the moment, of the opposite, that life as we know it encompasses the beginning and the end of the story, just as it encompasses the beginning and the end of all stories. All processes begin, go through a certain amount of struggle, ideally achieve their goal, and then they end, and then they begin again. This is the flow of nature. This is the flow of life. Life itself encompasses this. There's no way we can posit an end to it. So that's where I would say that we can't sort of just take the biblical story and apply it to this to all of time or something like that. Or that's where I'm hesitant to do so. I think, though,
Right.
that what we've talked about is an interesting approach, because what you're saying is, and I want to try and steelman it as much as possible here, what you're saying is that if we're talking about suffering, or if we want to use a different word, maybe tension or strife or something like that, there's the evil suffering or the evil strife, and then there's the strife that's necessary. And that rings true to me in my life, in the sense that if I would wish myself an optimal life, I would definitely not wish myself infinite pleasure forever. That's for a start. But what it would look like would be something like enough suffering, but not too much, right? So
Yeah.
that implies
Well,
that I have a certain sense for what that might be, right?
right.
And I think that's a promising way forward. So I don't know if I answered your question exactly, or if I did.
Right. So I think, well, this was another question I have, but I'm going to go back to the first one I asked first. I guess that's what I was trying to get at with my question is this. If the biblical story, I mean, and I could try to code it in talking about myth in general, but I think the reality is I'm talking about the biblical story.
Mhm.
The biblical story claims that life will arrange itself in a certain way. And when I look at the world, it seems to me, apparently through Nietzsche's observations in part, and Peterson's observations in part, and people like the Stoics and
Mhm.
the Taoists and some Buddhist observations, seem to identify the reality, seems to identify that reality that the Bible claims.
Mhm.
So, how do you make sense of that? I guess how you make sense of it seems to be that it comes from the root, the same place, that it's written from the root of that reality. So it makes sense that it would be descriptive.
Yeah.
Well, there's other things, though. I mean, I doubt you agree with the whole of the Christian corpus or the biblical
Yes.
corpus.
Right.
So
Yeah.
there's also that fact. But my experience is the more I come to understand, like I think both of the videos and this conversation have helped me to understand better, the more it seems to be true that life is really described in the terms that it claims they will be described in.
Mm. And I mean, yeah, I have a certain amount of resonance with that. Certainly Peterson's position. I was just listening to his talk with Dawkins, and he insisted that, the more he looks into the Bible, the more astounded he is at how much it does reflect reality. Um, Personally, I think that, what do I think about this? I think that when it comes to interpreting symbols, myths, stories, we're always doing two things at the same time, and sometimes it's impossible to disentangle them. One thing we're doing is we're getting real insights about the meaning of the myth or the story. The other thing we're doing is we're projecting onto the story, and we're making it fit certain conceptions. And I think we just always do that. And I think the fact that even if we look at biblical commentary, but biblical commentary by completely orthodox Christians, there's obviously variety there, and there's contradictory variety there. So it must be happening to some extent.
Yeah,
Um, and I think that's fine. I don't see anything wrong with that, and I don't see any way that we can permanently evade that. So I think that part of the issue is that people who have a deep connection with Christianity, whether that be for cultural reasons, whether that be because of a personal, spiritual, experiential connection, or whatever the reason, they're going to look at the Bible and they're going to basically say, whatever I find here will be good. Like it's you're not going to find
yeah,
something that you just say, okay, well, that's the Bible. Like that's
yeah,
wrong and bad and goodbye Bible. You're going to find things that are good. So I think that's what happens. And I think that happens with all scriptures. It clearly happens
yeah,
with other scriptures as well. Muslims only find good things in the Quran, Hindus only find good things in the Vedas, and so on and so forth. I, having said that, culturally and to a certain degree spiritually, am Christian. And so I do have that relationship to the Bible. I'm a bit cautious about it for the reasons I've outlined. At the same time, I don't know. The reason I'm able to make these kind of objections that I'm making in our talk today, for instance, is because I don't actually see the Bible as fully reflecting reality in every way. In
Right.
fact, I see certain Hindu conceptions in particular, for some reason, being more reflective of reality. So I kind of draw on different myths and different stories. So that would be my approach. Was that your question, though? I think I might have forgotten what the actual question was.
Yeah, so I think you were, I think you're, I think that answered the question pretty well. I think you're exactly right. In as Peterson is always quick to point out, uh, you have to give the devil his due, and
Mhm.
the devil in this context being postmodernism, and the due being uh, that any piece of literature is open to interpretation. So then you have to come to realize that there's bias inherent in any interpretation, and the reality is, instead of deciding that my conception of Christianity or that Christianity was wrong because I found myself agreeing with a contrary perspective, I attempted to harmonize the
Mhm.
two perspectives, which is in itself a natural bias. Now,
Mhm.
does that mean that I'm wrong necessarily? No. And I think you also have to look at the greater context. I don't think there are many Christians out there that would agree with many of the things that I have claimed.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
you also have to take that into context. The second question I had um, is in regards to Nietzsche.
Mhm.
So, all critics of Christianity often use the problem of evil
Mhm.
to criticize its validity. That
Mhm.
if there's an all good God, how could he have created a partially evil world or allowed a partially evil world to exist? And my question is, obviously Nietzsche isn't going to resolve
Mhm.
that problem from a Christian perspective, but I feel like it's still a problem that has to be resolved
Mhm.
by all religions and
Mhm.
worldviews and philosophies. And I think, how does Nietzsche resolve that? Because as we've discovered, there's obviously a point where there's too much suffering, and we can picture a much better life with less suffering.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
by nature, that means that all suffering isn't inherent to life, only some of it.
Mhm.
So, how would Nietzsche resolve, like, you know, cancer in children, or um, women being sold into slavery, or death from the result of natural disasters?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Because there has to be a good response to that, because I think it's inherent to life. Well, I think we've outlined an argument as to why a lot of that is not inherent to
Yeah.
life.
Yeah. That's a fantastic question. In a way, it's the best question, I think, that we could ask ourselves. And yes, Nietzsche was concerned about this. In fact, Aron van Os, who I've had a few talks with now, he's a bit of a Nietzsche scholar. He did his master's thesis on Nietzsche. The thesis is titled "The Pious Antichrist." He's actually looking for certain harmonies as well as noting tensions between Nietzsche and Christianity. And in his thesis, and this is available online, I think I might have linked to it in my first video with him, he talks about this idea of theodicy, of the problem of evil. And he says that Nietzsche was obsessed with this in a certain way. Obviously, it didn't concern God, but you can still be concerned with the problem of suffering and evil in the world and not and it not be a technical problem of how does God fit into the picture. So he called it a psychological theodicy. Nietzsche is concerned about a psychological theodicy. How do I deal with the presence of evil and suffering in the world? So what is his answer? I mean, how to put this best in a way that's not too confusing or gives the wrong idea. I mean, his ultimate answer is affirmation. He affirms the world as it is. That's the whole point of eternal return, being that the world is going to eternally repeat exactly as it's been. Are you able to affirm this? Are you able to say yes to it? So what is he doing here? So the first thing to note, I would say, is that Nietzsche is against moralizing reality itself. So morality is something for Nietzsche that I wouldn't phrase it as saying like it doesn't exist at all. It has no reality. The way I would interpret what he's saying is that it has a relative reality. It's relative to certain groups of people, for instance, with certain goals and intentions. But what morality isn't is it's not absolute. It can't be applied to the whole of existence. It just doesn't make sense to do that. It's a category mistake. Part of the reason that he believes that is that, well, there's many reasons. One is that it's a human formulation in his view, but another reason is that it is that life itself is constituted by violence and suffer. Well, at least violence, and you would say violence implies suffering in sentient beings. And that seems to be true. It seems very hard to argue against that in the sense of the world as we know it. The world that's composed of energy, that's continually changing, that entropy exists in. Like of course, biological organisms would need to feed on energy from their environment. Of course, there would be predation. Of course, there would be death. Of course, there would be disease. It seems to go from the very bottom to the very top. It seems that in a certain metaphorical way, at least, you could say that atoms and molecules are violent, the energy rich, assertive, destructive things. So that's part of why he thinks that you can't apply morality to the whole of existence because the whole of existence is constituted by violence.
It doesn't fit the terms of morality, is what
Yeah,
what it
it
seems like he's
doesn't
saying.
fit the terms of morality. So if you try and apply the terms of morality to the whole of existence, you end up having to condemn it. This is kind of what Schopenhauer did. He was the famous pessimist philosopher that Nietzsche learned a lot from. Um, Schopenhauer looks at existence and says it's evil, it's bad because it's constituted by violence and suffering. It's just this ceaseless striving of this blind will for more and more life. But Nietzsche says it's inappropriate to make that moral judgment about life. Life is the very thing which allows you to make any moral judgments at all, right? Life is the thing that encompasses you. That's why I think there's a certain parallel between life and God. To a certain extent, you can perhaps replace one with the other. Can we make moral judgments about God? I mean, Christians may have different views on this philosophically. I think that one interpretation of Job would be that no, it's actually inappropriate to make moral judgments about God. God is the very being that allows you to make moral judgments in the first place. God is the being that allows you to exist. I think St. Paul kind of argues to a similar effect when he talks about, God making people like he makes clay pots or whatever the exact metaphor is, right? So there's an ontological primacy to God that excludes us making moral judgments about him. You could say that Nietzsche applies that logic, but he applies it to life because he doesn't have a conception of God, so he applies it to life itself. And so that's part of it. The other part of it is, well, it's very I think that no one can really make this ultimate affirmation that Nietzsche proposes, right? because there's always going to be suffering that could overwhelm us, right?
Well,
I know
I
that, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
no, I think that was at the crux of it, because I think you end up in a position where you affirm all these horrible things and all this suffering in the world if you affirm life in that context. So I think, especially from an atheistic perspective, which Nietzsche seems to be. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you could say, Dawkins is agrees with Nietzsche, but they're both atheistic perspectives, and I think that uh, you're left with this problem, and I think this is the problem that I would suppose Nietzsche has, is you can't affirm it in its entirety. In the same way that I'm not sure that I can really argue that suffering in the terms we've described in this continuum can be eliminated entirely,
Mm.
I don't think he can
Mm.
say that it can be affirmed in entirety.
I would qualify that a little bit. So I would say that on the psychological level, can we affirm all of existence, everything that's happened? Yes, we can. There are times where we feel, and this was Nietzsche's point, where we feel so in love with life, so joyful about living, so affirmative about, who we are and the experience that we're nested in, that we feel like we can affirm everything that's ever happened. So I think that on a psychological level, can we do that act? Yes. It seems we can. But the other point I would make is that I can imagine I can imagine making that, I can imagine affirming all of existence. I can imagine feeling that feeling and making that mental act. But I also know there are innumerable occasions where I could be so overwhelmed with suffering that I would not be able to make that affirmation. Okay. But that doesn't nullify Nietzsche's view. And I think Nietzsche would probably agree with this, because he's not saying you have to be infallible. He's just saying that the best response to life is to affirm it all. Um, Also, God probably affirms it all. I mean, we're getting a little far afield, but he made it. Um, so anyway, so that's one thing, is that psychologically, there are times we can make the affirmation and there are times that we can't because suffering's too much, or the horror of witnessing evil is too much, or whatever it may be. But that doesn't mean that the solution to that theodicy is nullified. It just means that we can't happen to enact it, because Nietzsche's point is that a lot of this is physical, right? He emphasizes the body a lot, and he emphasizes psychological states as being dependent on the body. It's very, very, very difficult for someone who's, very depressed in a clinical sense to affirm life. It's just, there's a certain limit to what you can do. Maybe at best you can choose not to deny it. Maybe that's the best you can do. There are other times where, because of just the chemicals circulating in your brain, you can make that affirmation, right? So, and part of your neurophysiology depends also on strength and heroism and how far you've developed as a person and maturity, and all the things that that Peterson would propose.
Yeah.
So there's all that. And then, sorry, one more point. The other point I wanted to emphasize is that this is all only a problem in a way if it's possible for the world to be otherwise. Okay? So if it's possible for the world to be otherwise, if it's possible for children not to suffer, for instance, or at least to suffer grievously for no purpose, that's a problem. But Nietzsche wants to deny that. He wants to say that it's not conceivable that the world would be otherwise. It's not conceivable that you could remove just this suffering and nothing else. that if you remove anything that is, you remove the whole. Everything is knitted and intertwined together, okay? So that's part of the argument, and it's an essential part, because if the Christian comes to the same argument and they have a sense that some suffering is genuinely not necessary, it did not have to be, and it shouldn't be, that's going to create a different effect, if that makes sense.
It's going, okay. So it's not possible to have anything different than the world we have right now.
I think that's true on two levels, okay? Or at least there's two levels it could be true. One level is, and I think for Nietzsche both are true. So one level is that if determinism is true, right, then that just simply follows. Everything is entwined with everything else. That if you just remove one link in the chain, the whole just falls apart. So that's one level. Another level is less reliant. You don't have to be committed to determinism. There can be freedom in the picture. There can be chance. And that would be that there are certain things that are just essential to existence. So let me try and make that argument really quickly. It could be that chaos, unpredictability, is just essential to existence. And it could be that vulnerability to suffering is just essential to existence, just because of the way that physical matter is made up, et cetera, right? If you admit both of those, then you automatically admit the possibility that there will be senseless suffering for children, right? Because chaos is there, the unpredictable, and vulnerability to suffering. I think this is essentially Peterson's perspective, right? Like, because he doesn't fully embrace the whole heaven idea.
Well, I don't think that. So
And
if there's,
it
if
doesn't,
there's,
sorry, just one point of clarity. It doesn't mean
yes,
that you don't try and stop that suffering from occurring whenever you see it occurring, right? That doesn't follow. But it just means that on a psychological and philosophical level, you're not trying to reach a world or posit a world where there wouldn't be that suffering. It doesn't mean that it makes you more callous or it makes you avoid helping people or anything like that.
it's, so a lot was said there, and I'm trying to
Yeah, sorry.
think. So chaos and suffering, if both of those are necessary to life, then you have to affirm the suffering of children. You have to affirm absolute suffering, right, in the worst possible way you can imagine.
Yeah, because if that's true, then any form of suffering that human beings are capable that is consistent with the laws of physics can happen in that universe.
Is that, so then you have to get in a conversation about whether chaos and
Exactly.
suffering are essential to existence, and
Yes.
I think in some sense they probably are, because free will doesn't exist without chaos and suffering doesn't exist without finite beings. Or I mean, I meant that in reverse. So free will can only exist with chaos, and finite creatures can only exist with lack. Right? So, but the question is, are those contained by a higher order truth? In which you can envision a world that those two concepts are essential to life, but are contained by a higher order truth that stop them from reaching the point of suffering in children. And I would say that that's the Christian perspective, and that higher order truth is self-sacrificial love in some sense. It's the self-sacrificial love of God. But the problem in the Christian idea is that we rejected God's position in that and thus loosed these things to be put in outside of their proper place. That's kind of the argument we've been outlining.
Okay, so let me just summarize that, because that's really good. So God, it's almost like you're saying God himself can do that, does the Nietzschean affirmation in a way. It's not appropriate for us to do it, but God does it because he admits chaos and suffering into being, because that is necessary for limited free beings.
Yes.
And so that's an act of self-sacrificial love, because let's say he suffers with us or something like that. He feels for us. We reject his love, and that makes things worse. And so even though you had chaos and suffering to begin with, they were at least in their right places. They were conducive to an overall good, but now they are not conducive to that overall good a lot of that time, but actually just make things worse. That's the fallen world. Would that be a fair summary of what you were saying?
Right. Everything is upside down. Things are not in their proper place. Leadership becomes tyranny. Like you can look at across the virtues, love becomes lust, right? Humility becomes pride. All of these things are inverse. They're not where they're supposed to be. And that, I would say that also, or we could suppose, and I should say, because I'm not sure if I said this before, I'm working through these ideas as we're talking about them. I'm not certain of them, and it's possible that in 2 days I could say, no, this is nonsense, or I
absolutely.
could think that this is accurate for the rest of my life. But you can imagine that God contains chaos and sacrifice. And this is, you get into dualism, right, or non-dualism with this conversation, which is something that comes up in the conversation with Jordan Hall on Why Christianity. And this idea that God contains those things. Similarly, if you look at Job, for example, one of the common misunderstandings of that passage is that Satan is a person described in Job, where actually it's the Satan is the original text, is a correct translation. So it's a role that someone occupies, and that person has a place in heaven where he's given a specific task, which is to test men. And what happens when he comes to God is the problem is not his testing of Job or his desire to test Job. It is that he tries to position himself above God. He makes a judgment about Job that puts him in a position above God. So then it becomes a question of God's authority on who's right, whether Job is right or whether the Satan is right, or whether God is right in their judgment of Job's character. So that's an important part of the story, that the role of the accuser is God ordained. So there's a place for these bad concepts. But the problem is we live in a world where those things have been taken out of their proper context. So that's an interesting thought.
Yes.
Ultimately, what you said in Nietzsche's idea of affirming life, I think there's a certain amount that has to happen, even from a Christian perspective. I think to exist, you have to, to operate in the world, you have to, under some level, willingly take on the reality, which is, again, suffering. And I think that in heaven, we also have to take that perspective that the suffering was worth it, or that value, that in the end, the suffering has value. My question is if you can make that statement without the end, without the meaning or purpose of it afterwards. And I think, I'm not sure, because So one of my favorite movies is Everything Everywhere All at Once, because I don't know if you've seen the film.
No.
But it's very nihilistic. But it's this descent into nihilism and then evolution from it.
Mm-hmm.
And you get into these ideas of infinite realities where infinite things are true, and the characters are faced with that reality and think, well, what's the point of anything if everything has happened? What's the point of the choices I make when in another universe someone's made a different choice? Why am I specifically, of all the infinite number of me's, inflicted with this particular suffering when there's another person who does it? And that brings a sort of nihilism. And in the end, the conclusion that redeems that is that love is the thing that gives value to the reality of that suffering, and that the moments of love in their lives and the relationship bring value to that nihilism. And I think there's a sense in which I think Nietzsche could affirm life with that idea, that love gives meaning to the suffering. But that's really it's the same claim that Christianity makes, except for Christianity goes a step beyond that, which is to say that there will be a time when love triumphs over evil.
Yeah. I mean, man, there's a lot to think about there. I mean, I loved your question. Can you make that statement of affirmation without the meaning afterwards, or the purpose afterwards? I think that's a really key question here. I'm not sure. I'm not sure of my answer. Obviously, Nietzsche would say, yes, you can. That was his whole point. And I guess the Christian perspective would be, no, we actually need the story to be nested into. We need the biblical story with the biblical ending. I think that's something I'll ponder on a bit more. I have to say, I probably have to go in just a minute. So maybe we could round out this talk, and then we can always potentially do future talks as well, if we wanted to continue it. But no, I mean, I've found this to be really, really interesting. And yeah, I found you to be a really good conversation partner as well. The way that you can sort of break things down really logically, but at the same time, with a really like engaged, emotionally resonant aspect to it too. What I'm trying to say is you're not just sort of like some abstract logic chopper, but you're able to break things down in a really clear way and sort of lay them out and lay out thought experiments as well. So I think this has been really fruitful for me. That the question that I just mentioned, right? Can we make the affirmation without the meaning after life, or after this life? That's something I'll have to ponder on a little bit more. And I'll also have to have more of a think about just this whole idea of chaos and suffering being intrinsic to existence, yes, but being perhaps, there's a way in which they're evil and out of place, and there's a way in which they're performing the role that they were created to, that is not evil and not negative. That could be a way of fleshing out the idea of the life to come in a way that's more logical and something that you would strive for. I think there's other issues that we won't go into now with like eternity and living forever, et cetera, et cetera. I hope to sort of write a bit of an article about those soon. But yeah, I mean, those are my thoughts. Well, I guess my one thought I'll just end with is that with that point you were talking about love. I mean, yes, a lot of people say this, and it almost seems, what's the word, a bit trite to keep saying it. But yes, I mean, love does seem to be something that we can experience in life that is so rich and so powerful and so meaningful that it seems to give meaning to our very existence and potentially to all of existence. It also seems to be a way to express that feeling of affirmation that we have. It almost seems like we need someone to love. Even Nietzsche uses the metaphor of the woman life, that he loves. He loves her unconditionally. This is in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. The book culminates with his dance with life, where he declares to her that he loves her, regardless of the fact that he will die, regardless of the fact that in that sense she will be unfaithful to him, but he just loves her. And I take, I take that as being at least, if not the same thing as love of God, at least a step very definitely on the way to love of God. I think that these two things are very close together, the affirmation of life and the love of God.
Yeah.
So I think that's the thought that I'll sort of end with. Is there anything that you wanted to end with?
Um, I would affirm what you just said. I think you cannot hate life
Mm.
and love God.
Mm-hmm.
Those two perspectives are incompatible, just like you cannot hate people and love
Mm-hmm.
God. That just
Yes.
doesn't work. Um, taking the perspective of hating life only leads to hell.
Yes.
And I mean that in the sense that Peterson means it.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, a psychological hell that you bring upon yourself and inflict pain on other people to
Mm-hmm.
bring them to your level. I think that there's a lot more to be said about this idea of things not in their proper place. I think
Mm-hmm.
that that's the whole concept of the fall is
Mm-hmm.
all things being arranged outside of their proper context.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd love to talk about that more. That's something that I've thought about a lot. And I would hope that no one takes what I say as a representative of the Christian faith, because as I said, I'm still learning and developing these thoughts. And my hope instead would be that people will take this conversation as I have to try and understand better the nature of life. I think there are some
Mm-hmm.
things in this conversation that help to clarify that.
Mm-hmm.
And I appreciated talking with you, and I would love to talk more about a number of topics. I'm
Mm-hmm.
sure we have a lot of things in common if we both watched these people for so long. So
Yes. Yes. Yes, we'll definitely have to have another conversation. But yeah, this one has been fantastic, like I said. Um, but yeah, have a good night and thank you for this.
same to you. Good evening.